Hello there. Now, with all of Federation's best intentions at heart, with the general attitude of put your best foot forward, always greet the universe with open arms, and the power of positivity will prevail, despite all the best intentions of every aspect of the Federation, not everyone out there is as receptive to the peaceful, happy, friendly face of the Federation, or indeed to peace in general. That is not to say that every member of every individual race that we are about to discuss is inherently dangerous, as there is infinite diversity and infinite combinations. It's just sometimes those combinations lean more heavily towards a violent tendency. And this isn't even systemic to a race. It's not even necessarily throughout their history. Humans being a great example within the Star Trek universe is starting out as a much more violent civilization, but evolving over time to learn to at least temper those impulses to become something better, or at least attempt to generally, on average, be something more noble. The same thing can be said of the Ferengi, the same thing can be said of the Vulcans. Races that in some ways started out more aggressive, but learned to temper it. Particularly humans and Vulcans in that analogy. So with that out of the way, let's get started in today's topic. The most violent races in Star Trek. Now, for some context, this is not a definitive list. I've tried to think of as many races as I can that seem to stand out as particularly violent, and not just have an individual amongst them who turned out to be quite dangerous or violent or unpleasant, or did one thing in their time that made them particularly that way, such as Anoraks with the Krenim. There's no evidence that the Krenim are systemically violent people, but the crimes that Anoraks committed are some of the most abhorrent imaginable, but that doesn't mean that all Krenim were like that. This is more or less of the majority of this race that we encounter tend to lean towards a more violent, or at least aggressive warrior outlook on the universe. With that said, let's get started with the obvious one, the Klingons. First encountered by humanity in the 22nd century, Klingon-human relations and Klingon relations with the Federation have usually best been rocky, if not open warfare, up until the late 23rd century when things began to change and cool down between the two powers, with a bit of mutual respect, particularly when the Enterprise C sacrificed itself defending a Klingon colony against Romulan aggression. The Romulans were busy bombing the planet out of existence, and it was a Starfleet vessel that came to their aid when it didn't have to. And although it was not actually successful in defeating the Romulans and saving the Klingon colony, what it did was an act of honour and loyalty which the Klingons respected. Many things about Klingon culture are misunderstood. They are a very honourable and spiritual people, but they do have an inherently violent side, don't they? With many of their rituals and aspects of their society revolving around violent traditions. Next, the Borg. This one's a bit of an ambiguous one because the Borg don't even have soldiers. They have tactical drones, which are the closest thing to a soldier they have. The Borg don't build warships, they build assimilation vessels. They don't build scientific ships, they just build assimilation cubes. The Borg don't explore space, they look for new targets to assimilate to improve themselves. Technology that they can absorb, races or individuals that will improve the Borg. They are more of a force of nature, but that force of nature is kind of a hurricane or a tornado mixed with a volcano, and an asteroid coming to smite your planet from space in the form of a great big cube that's going to scoop up most of your population and turn them into more drones that'll go forth and do the same thing. It is an act of violence. It's also an incomprehensible level of malevolence. The Borg don't care about negotiation. They don't care about surrender. They don't care about life. They don't care about death. They merely care about improving themselves as they see it. The Borg represent, as I said, more of a force of nature, but it's a violent force of nature. Next, the Jem'Hadar. The Dominion in general, but we'll focus on the Jem'Hadar. There's some speculative evidence that the Jem'Hadar started out as an actual species that were genetically modified, similar to an augment from a human. Technically, probably the same race, or at least close enough, but genetically distinct, as augments were genetically distinct from humans. Jem'Hadar were all male. There has never been any female Jem'Hadar witnessed, and in dialogue it is stated by them that there are no women. They only live for a maximum of 20 years, probably because they die in battle. They're addicted to a drug called Ketracel White that keeps them loyal. Physically, they are strong, durable, have a natural ability to make themselves invisible, and they just literally live to fight. Their other skills are limited. Jem'Hadar do not make great engineers, they do not make great doctors. They are trained in basic field medicine and repair and maintenance. Although it's likely the Jem'Hadar have something to do with the construction of Dominion ships, it won't be their exact main area of expertise. They are pretty much bred for war, and from the moment their accelerated aging kicks in from infancy and they start maturing, they just want to fight. This is a race, literally an entire civilization dedicated to war. It's more complicated than that because the Dominion is more complicated than that, but focusing solely on the Jem'Hadar and putting them in a bubble, you see a race that literally exists to do nothing but fight and die for the Dominion and the founders. Next, the Cardassians. Actually a good example of, in some cases, shades of grey, but even the Cardassians we meet who are good, like Garak, have often got quite a shady past. But the Cardassians are a good example of a race that goes through waves. We know that Cardassians, centuries before their contact with humans, were a much more peaceful race with a civilian government. It wasn't until the military took over that they became expansionistic and aggressive. Cardassians have no rules of war. Cardassians will target civilians. They will use any tactic they feel will lead to victory. They will build any weapon, use any technology. They will deploy as many soldiers as are necessary to accomplish the goal. They will destroy as many enemy soldiers as they see fit. You will be obliterated or you will be subjugated. The Cardassians, at the height of their imperial age, one of the most despicable, violent and untrustworthy races in the Alpha Quadrant. Maybe not one of the most powerful, but certainly a race you didn't want to tangle with, and one that you had to be very careful when dealing with. Every ship they built typically was a warship, but we did see sparks of humanity. Even in individuals like Gul Dukat, we did see elements that there was a little more going on. Just they needed time. It wasn't until the humbling of the Dominion War that the Cardassians would finally start to go back to maybe how they were before. And we see in the distant future, Cardassians, some of them are even part of the Federation. The Breen. Again, a difficult one to quantify. We don't know that all Breen are an inherently violent race, but all the Breen we ever meet are violent, antisocial, somewhat standoffish to aliens. They don't like non-Breen. They are fiercely territorial and isolationist as a people to a degree, although not to the same severity as a race like Tholians or the Sheliak. But the Breen are very quick to turn to their weapons. They've defeated Klingon navies, Federation armadas, and destroyed Romulan outposts without much problem. They've demonstrated to be one of the bravest warrior races around, willing to endure huge casualties if it means getting the point across of the victory. For example, they attacked Starfleet headquarters during the Dominion War. The attack was insignificant overall, with only a bit of damage to the Golden Gate Bridge and some superficial structural damage, with almost every Breen ship being destroyed before it even reached Earth, and the few that did reach Earth were shot down before they were able to do any significant damage by Earth's orbital defenses. And the ground defenses, like shields and other such defense systems, would have prevented mass damage by the Breen. So the attack itself was futile, but it got the message across. The Breen were not afraid to die. This is a race, again, individually brave. To the point where the Romulans even had a saying about them: you never turn your back on a Breen, because you simply can never trust what they're going to do, would be the answer. And if the Romulans think that of them, damn. Next, the Xindi Reptilian. I focus on the Xindi Reptilian specifically because the insectoids, despite their impulsive nature, yes, they were very aggressive, but they actually showed that they were willing to listen and think. When they were presented with real evidence that the sphere builders were behind the creation of the spheres and were lying to them, they were actually willing to switch sides and actually look at the evidence again and reason that perhaps humanity was not their enemy. Whereas the Reptilians, still pretty much in possession of that knowledge themselves, were willing to ignore it because it meant more power for them. The Reptilians were willing and able to unleash their tactical capabilities and their aggressiveness on other Xindi. They wanted to become the dominant amongst them, and if that meant burning Earth to a cinder in order to accomplish their own manifest destiny as they saw it to be the greatest of all the Xindi, then that is exactly what they were going to do. And they didn't care who stood in their way or what was thrown in their way. Even when some reptilians would speak out and question things, they were quickly put down and threatened with their lives. The reptilians embraced warfare and self-sacrifice in a way that even the insectoids couldn't really match. The Terrans. Terrans are humans who never learn to grow up. Pirates, murderers, savages, barbarians, give them whatever name you want. The Terran Empire was still very successful. Terrans were biologically near identical to a human, but culturally were extraordinarily different despite some superficial similarities. The Terrans were empire builders, they were warlike, dangerous, aggressive, prone to infighting, but outwardly expansionistic, and, had a real love of conquest. They saw themselves as a superior race compared to other species, which gave them an inherent sense of inflated self-worth, and saw non-Terrans as inferior to them and there to simply serve a purpose, even going as far as to literally eat some sentient races. This showed the level of contempt they had for them, because there was no other need for that. There was plenty of food, and they were frankly replicators. There was no need to do that, but they chose to do it anyway. Terrans were barbaric and they were violent. And although you could say maybe redeemable as normal humans were redeemable, we even see during the time of the rebellion, even after 80 or 90 years of being humbled under the Alliance, the Terrans are still building warships, they're still working as pirates, they're still infighting, and their aggressive tendencies are still very much on the surface for all to see. They may have been humbled in their arrogance, but not tempered in their aggressive ways. There's no evidence that we learn that the Terrans ever grow past that and retain this inherently more violent cultural state, although as they are biologically the same as humans, unless there are some minor chromosomal differences that are tweaking their neural chemistry to actually make them more violent, not just more capable of dealing with it, then it could be a cultural thing, as we do see some Terrans acclimatized to life in the Prime Universe when they escaped there at the fall of the Empire, even becoming Starfleet officers. And unlike Lorca, who did the same thing, although he was able to mask himself as a regular Starfleet officer, he never abandoned his true nature. Those Terrans that came across did. The Reman are another good example. I don't use the Romulans because the Romulans are big into subterfuge. They're a lot like humans and Vulcans. They seem to be very aggressive and violent, yes, but in reality Romulans prefer to avoid a fight. Unlike Klingons and others, they don't go looking for it. They don't relish a fight. They're not afraid of it, but they prefer to manipulate and pull the strings from behind the scenes in order to accomplish their victory. The Reman, however, born into darkness, constantly oppressed and brutalized, it breeds a strong, savage race in many ways that are not afraid of violence. And all of our encounters with Reman so far have shown them to be an aggressive and quite militant people. But some of that could be culturally encouraged by the Romulans. So it's a bit of a hard one to fully put your finger on, but the Reman are certainly brave, warlike, and definitely capable of kind of giving their all when it comes to a good fight. The Gorn are another exceptional example of a race that, although we have seen their ability, they can be diplomatic. Gorn can negotiate and work with others. We even saw one overcome maybe its instincts, we can assume, to work with Ensign Ortegas from the USS Enterprise when stranded on a planet. They overcame their differences and were able to work together. Now, although that Gorn was ultimately killed by other humans, which is another story I've actually done a video about, the Gorn generally, we see, are aggressive. They don't see other races as their equals. In fact, they see us as incubators and for their young, and realistically there's no reason for that. You could use cattle. You could use other creatures. Clearly they evolved on a planet where they didn't do this, but they go out hunting for other sentient beings, pluck them and take them to their breeding planets. There's no reason to do that other than capriciousness. And it comes with a race that seem to be inherently more violent, because every encounter with them is a violent one. They attack an Earth colony that prompts the USS Enterprise under Kirk to respond to them and retaliate. They aggressively attack other Federation worlds that cause ships like the Farragut and the Enterprise to also intervene and have to deal with them. The constant border pushing of the Federation after the Federation-Klingon War showed that they had aspirations, maybe not of imperialism, but certainly of domination. Hirogen are another good example, although again we do see some growth in their society, and there were Hirogen, at least individuals amongst them, that were more evolved. The Hirogen saw other races as nothing more than prey items, and similar to the Terrans, they even had a tendency to eat said prey items, boiling up their organs for consumption, taking their skeletons away as trophies of the hunt, then displaying them on their hulls. Their ships were built like wolves in space to hunt down and pack hunt or individually bring down other starships. The Hirogen don't overly seem that interested in hunting on the ground, as in like going to a planet, but I suppose they could be doing that as well. But they seem to prefer a challenge. Attacking a colony, which you can easily attack from orbit, is not as satisfying as hunting down a starship that has weapons, defenses, and can maneuver in the three-dimensional space of space. Is more of a challenge to overcome those defenses, board the ship, and take the crew. They see this as a personal challenge, and it's something that they want to do because they reap some great rewards in their society. Hirogen are bloody violent. The Swarm. We don't see much of the Swarm, but like many xenophobic and deeply territorial races like the Breen, Tholians, and others, they seem to respond with 0 to a 10 to a billion on the aggressor index as soon as someone violates their space. You leave them alone, they seem to perceptibly leave you alone. But the moment you enter their space, they fall on you like a swarm of bees and will sting you to death with all their smaller vessels. Again, it's reasonable to conclude they do have bigger ships, but all the smaller ones will fall on you and drain your ship of power and board your ship and kill the crew, and then leave it there as a symbol for others to see. It's possible the Greater Swarm Society is more peaceful than this, and they just live under a dictatorship of some kind that doesn't tell their people that this is going on, and they play it off that all the alien races out there are dangerous, and every time one of them gets in their space, it's a threat, and it's coming there to invade, and it could be that. Saying that, well, those little ships coming from that star system over there, they're carrying all kinds of things that we don't want in our space. Loads of hungry mouths to feed that will try and settle on our worlds and steal our food. They're going to bring in narcotics and weapons and dangerous ideas of cultural exchange and changes to our society that we simply cannot tolerate. It's possible, but I am reaching a little bit there. What we see of the Swarm is a race that build all their ships and their technology to secure and defend their territory literally like a swarm of bees that does not want anyone in their space. They don't care about warning you. The most you get is a bit of a barrier that you know you shouldn't cross, and the warning symbols of all the dead ships with the murdered crews on floating around, just symbolically telling you don't come in here. As long as you skirt their territory, they seem to leave you alone. But from what we see of them, very violent. Now, of course, there are other races that we encounter that are quite aggressive or violent, but in different ways. The Kazon are a good example, but I'm not including them specifically on this list. Unless you disagree with me, let me know in the comment section down below. The Kazon are a violent people, but they were made that way by the Trabe, who you could argue were more violent for what they did to the Kazon. The Kazon, though, often demonstrated an ability to negotiate, to work with others and cooperate with each other. It's wrong to say that the Kazon are an inherently violent people because we simply don't know that. The Kazon have been brutalized, and the current structure of Kazon society is one that's almost so chaotic that it doesn't lend itself to anything other than imperialism. It's likely that if the Kazon sects unified, they would become some kind of empire, but it's not a guarantee. The Kazon have a sense of justice. They have a sense of right from wrong and even decency. we see when dealing with individual Kazons that they can rise above what is superficially seen as these baser aggressive instincts, as can Klingons and others. So again, I default to they're not necessarily as bad as they seem. Same with the Vidians. They're not inherently evil, they're just desperate. The Orions, yes, they're slavers and they're many things, but many Orions are actually quite agreeable and easy enough to get along with, and when you start to understand the subtleties of their culture and how piracy and other things in their culture are seen as virtuous, but not necessarily being barbarians going around slaughtering people is seen as okay, there's more to them. The Husnock, another race we encounter vaguely, they seemingly sent an incredibly powerful warship to wipe out a Federation colony. Their entire race was wiped out by a higher being, and as a result we don't know anything else about them. For all we know, the Husnock, yes, maybe overreacted to the presence of a Federation colony, but for all we know they claimed that world and that ship was sent out to purge it. It wouldn't be the first time someone did something like that. Violent, perhaps. Naturally just an aggressive species? Hard to say, because we simply don't know enough about them. And as I said, there are many other races that show a flair for aggression, such as the Miradorn, even the Dosai. But lumping them into the list of these races are inherently violent is inherently wrong, and a bit judgmental. Every race on this list, we have seen in many cases individuals amongst them who are better, and shows that, like any sentient race, that there is diversity and the potential for change. And where there is the potential for change, there is the potential for peace. Even the Klingons become members of the Federation, after all. But that is the end of my list. Feel free to add any races you think I missed in the comment section down below, and whether you disagree with anyone that's on my list. This is not a list, by the way, because I didn't properly state this at the beginning, of like least violent to most violent or anything like that. It's just races that typically stand out, as every encounter with them seems to be one where they demonstrate a disregard for life and generally violent tendencies. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Please like, share and subscribe, and if you made it all to the video, thank you for watching, and bye bye.